So in this section, we're going to start talking about 2 out of the 4 carbon-containing molecules of life. So we talked about water in the last section and how important that is to life as we know it. But the other thing that is incredibly important to life, the way we know it at least, is carbon. So the element carbon. So carbon is a fairly unique atom, fairly unique element. It can form up to 4 covalent bonds with other atoms. So that can be 4 separate atoms. It can do double bonds. It can even do triple bonds. Okay, there are no quadruple bonds, but it can do triple bonds. But it can bind up to 4 other atoms. It can also bind other carbon atoms, which is pretty unique because not all elements can bind other elements or other atoms of the same element, especially not covalently. Okay, so these properties of carbon allow basically large or small molecules, compounds, to form with a carbon backbone at the center of it. So it has 3 basic structures. You have straight chains, okay, so they can be written out like this, where you can see all of the hydrogens that are bonded to each carbon. And you'll notice that this carbon here is bonded to 3 hydrogens and 1 other carbon. So it has 4 total bonds. And then when you get over here, this carbon is double bonded to the next carbon, and then single bonded to the one on the left, and single bonded to the hydrogen. So it has 4 total bonds, because this double bond counts as 2. Okay, so this straight chain is showing you all of the hydrogens, all of the carbons, everything. This is a simplified structure of the same compound. It's just instead of writing all of the hydrogens out where they kind of are in the molecule, it just kind of shortens that. Because you know that if you have 3 hydrogens, they're going to be equally spaced around this carbon. If you have 2, you're going to have 1 up and 1 down. Okay? And here, this one is just kind of out, the way it's shown here, basically. Okay, so this is just a simplified version of this compound here, right? So that's a straight chain. This is a relatively short straight chain of carbons, but you can have really a ton of carbons lined up together. The most that you generally see biologically sometimes gets up into the 30s, 30 carbons in a row. But when you talk about organic chemistry, sometimes you can get even larger compounds. Generally, straight chains are not one of the most researched compounds. The bigger they get, the kind of more constricted they are as to what they can do. So you also have branch chains. So branch chains, you're going to have, basically you have your carbon backbone here. Okay, so it's the longest continuous carbon chain. And then you have another branch of carbons coming off of that. Okay, this you see a lot in some storage molecules. So if they're storing sugars or if they're storing energy or something like that in the form of a compound, you will see a lot of branches usually. It's best for kind of using up the space in the most efficient way. Okay? It packs everything in a lot closer than if you just had straight chains. Okay? And then finally, you also can have rings. So these are just the basic structures. There are some other weird ones that can get added in, but we're not going to look at those in this class. So ring structures obviously form a loop of carbons. So here you've got the 6 carbon backbone that forms a ring structure. Okay. This compound, or this ring here, if you exclude everything that's on the outside, is actually called benzene. Okay, so a benzene ring is just 6 carbons bonded together in a ring, and you have 3 double bonds included in that. Okay, this one with the different groups added onto the carbons, okay, so hanging off of the ring, this is vanillin. So this is the compound that produces vanilla, the flavor of vanilla. So, straight chains, branch chains, and rings are the three basic structures that carbon compounds can form. So, carbon-based molecules can be made up of many small subunits bonded together. That can be a small compound, it can be what we're going to learn about in the next section, amino acids, it can be sugars, it can be anything like that. The monomer is the individual subunit. Okay, so it's basically the repeating subunit, or it's the one complete unit that gets bonded together. Okay, so it's a monomer is the small single individual subunit, and then the polymer is many of those monomers bonded together. Okay, so if we look at this here, this is depicting sugars, so these are ring-structured carbon compounds. So here you have a single monomer, okay, because it's just looking at the one. You can also have something called a dimer, which is just two of them together, okay, and then a polymer is multiple monomers bonded together, okay. And if you go on into higher level biologies, they will get into how the different compounds are bonded together, and basically which carbons are bonded together, and so on and so forth, because that can actually cause quite a bit of difference in the overall compound. But alright, so when talking about the four carbon-based molecules of life, they are carbohydrates, lipids, amino acids or proteins, and then nucleic acids. So right now we're just going to focus on the carbohydrates. So if you look at the name, you can actually kind of tell a lot about the carbohydrate itself. So let's break down the name here. We've got carbo, so obviously that is referring to carbon, and then hydrates. So hydrates is actually referring to water. So carbohydrates generally have kind of a formula of CH2O, okay, and it can come in many different multiples of that, so like you can get a C2H4O2, okay, and so on and so forth, but generally carbohydrates come in that ratio, okay. So here you've got C6H12O6, this is glucose. You're going to get really friendly with it later on. Glucose is one of the more common simplified sugars that you will see in this course, especially when we talk about photosynthesis and respiration metabolism. Okay, this is basically, I mean, you see it everywhere in human biology, plant biology, all of that. So glucose is just a simple sugar broken down for energy or created to store energy. And it is a carbon ring with 5 carbons in the ring and 1 on the outside. And then the 6th spot on that 6-atom ring is an oxygen. Okay, so that's why you have this, it looks just like a circle, basically, on the simplified version. Okay, that is actually standing for the oxygen. That tells you kind of how the molecule is oriented, is based on where that oxygen is. So that's the only reason why it's actually denoted. Okay. Carbohydrates, obviously made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. You will not find another element bonded as part of the carbohydrate. You might have some additional things added on to the carbohydrate later, but those are additional signaling molecules that you don't consider part of the carbohydrate. It includes sugars and starches, and when you're talking about sugars, okay, you get some kind of other weird names in it, and don't ever ask me how to spell this in, like, without it look right in front of me, but monosaccharides basically are simple sugars. So you have one subunit of the sugar, okay, and then you also have polysaccharides. So polysaccharides are complex sugars. So basically these are chains of sugars bonded together. So you got a couple different examples here. You have starches, cellulose, and glycogen. So this is starch. So you can see that starch itself is actually a very branched molecule. Okay, so this is kind of similar to the carbon branch chains that we looked at, except this is branching with the entire molecule itself. Okay, so this is a starch. If you look closely, you can actually see the different glucose molecules all bonded together. Okay, so each individual glucose molecule is a monosaccharide, but then when you get them all together, they are polysaccharides. Okay, so very similar to the monomer-polymer thing here. Okay, monomer and polymer is more of a general term, so it deals with like plastics and everything. Those are polymers. Okay, the compounds that make up plastics are polymers. You can also have organic polymers where it's basically a long chain of different things bonded together that is produced by a biological organism of some kind. Like I studied spider silk proteins, and the spider silk itself was considered an organic polymer, okay, because the spider, a living organism, produced it, but it was long chains of repeating amino acid sequences, so it was considered a polymer. Alright, so carbohydrates are actually the main storage system in the body, or they're the preferential storage system in the body. So they get broken down for energy. They are readily broken down for energy, and the body really likes using carbohydrates. It goes through that really quickly. Okay, that's why if you ever see a diabetic and they say that they're crashing, they don't have energy or something like that, generally they will eat something with some sugar in it. Sugars are very simple carbohydrates, very easy to break down. So your body can get that energy out into the rest of the body very quickly. Okay. Some carbohydrates you will actually see as part of the cell structure, which you'll see later when we get into the organelles and the different structures of the cell. They are generally on the outside of the cell, just linked onto the cell, and they are used for signaling between cells. So here we have two very similar molecules. Okay, we have starch on the top, which we looked at just a little bit ago, and we also have cellulose. So the main difference between these two is that cellulose is straight, rigid chains of glucose monomers. Okay? And starch is branched chains of those glucose monomers. Okay? You'll also notice that the bonding is slightly different, the way it's kind of angled, so it's not as rigid. Here it is incredibly rigid. Okay? And you're not going to get much branching. So cellulose will not is not efficient with its space in storing those glucose molecules. Okay, so starch is the body's preferential quick energy source. Okay, that's why a lot of breakfast foods around the world actually include a lot of starches. So if you think cereal, bagels, toast, baguettes, anything like that generally has starch in it. Okay, and that is kind of a way of kickstarting your metabolism every morning to get it back in gear and back working. Okay, not saying that's the only thing you can have for breakfast, but it's kind of one of those general observations. Okay, and we are going to pause here and do lipids in the second video.